Hey, welcome back, everybody. We're reading Copper Sun by Sharon Draper, and we are going to Chapter 7, Ship of Death. The water, which never stopped rocking the small boat, carried them swiftly to the side of the huge ship. As they got closer, she knew she had been right. It was a place of death. Amari could not see the top of it. It rested upon the great water like a beast, ready to swallow them all up, she felt. Two of the captives who had been yoked together grew hysterical as they approached the looming structure and leaped without warning into the sea. The slave women gasped as one. Amari did not know the language of her captors, but she could tell they cursed as nets were cast overboard for the escaped slaves. Amari and the other prisoners in her boat watched, however, in horrid fascination as the two women, a mother and daughter, tried in vain to swim back to shore. The mother struggled to keep her daughter afloat, but the chains were heavy and they were weak from hunger and captivity. Suddenly, the mother disappeared from sight for a moment, only to reemerge screaming in agony. The ocean bled bright red. Two huge gray fish with fins of silver surfaced for just a moment, their backs gleaming in the sunlight. One of them clenched a brown arm in his teeth. Then both mother and daughter disappeared. Amari stared at the spot, waiting for them to reappear. They didn't. She had held her breath through the whole thing. She was so stunned, she could not even pray. So take a minute to think what those two fish were. It's pretty easy to guess. But there will be a common thing on this journey. The sailors were now even angrier than before. The whips slashed across the backs of the remaining slaves once more, as if those still alive had to pay for the loss of the two who had died. No one else tried to jump. A rough plank had been rigged for them to climb from the small boat to the ship. It was narrow and shaky, but the sailors made sure the women had no opportunity to escape into the sea, should they dare. When she got to the deck, Amari stood amazed. It was like a small city made of wood. Poles, taller than any tree, reached to the sky. Loud, flapping pieces of cloth, larger than a hut, were attached to the poles by ropes, some of which were thicker than her whole body. Barrels and boxes littered the area, and dozens of men ran around shouting at one another and clapping one another on the back. They were laughing and cheerful, but Amari noticed that everyone seemed to carry a weapon, a gun, a sword, a knife. Confused and frightened, she didn't know what to think. Amari had very little time to think anyway. A whip lashed across her shoulder as she gazed around the ship, and she was quickly jolted back to reality. She jumped and yelped at the sudden pain. She and the other women were herded to one side of the deck, where a hole in the floor waited. They were pushed into that hole and slid down into what Amari knew just had to be the underworld. She wished that she had breathed more of the fresh air on the deck and in the boat, for the air in this place seemed to have been sucked out and replaced with the smells of sweat and vomit and urine. The male slaves had all been loaded before them, and she looked in disbelief at the sight before her. On narrow shelves made of wood, hundreds of naked men and boys lay chained together, wrists, necks, and legs held tightly by iron shackles. Only a few inches separated one man from another. Each man had about 6 inches of headroom, not even enough to sit up. Under the upper level of boards, a second level had been constructed, and under that, a third. Each row of shelves held men, human beings, chained like animals and stacked like logs for the fire, row after row, shelf after shelf. The first row seemed to have more headroom and breathing area, but the second and third rows beneath them were already slimy with waste. The men on the bottom were splattered with the blood of the men who had been beaten, as well as the vomit and urine and feces that the men chained above them had no choice but to eliminate where they lay. A large rat ran across Amari's feet as they were marched past the men. She felt faint. Surely this could not be real. Some of the women cried out as they found a man they knew. Amari did not want to see Besa tied like an animal. She turned her head and moved on. So just to pause for a second, this is how human beings, slaves, Africans were placed into the slave ships. They were packed in like animals. If you guys, look on Google, or you have been to a farm before, or you see videos in the farm, they have animals packed up in rooms, side by side, packed in sheep, cows, pigs, chickens, just livestock in general, usually packed in farms. That's how they did these human beings. They packed them together very, very closely. And if we look here, I went and tried to find diagrams of slave ships, and as you can kind of see here, um, they were packed in very, very tightly on these slave ships. This is a British slave ship. It held 292 slaves. 130 of these being stowed under the shells, as shown. Here, men, boys, women, as you can tell, but they're like shoulder to shoulder. Like they don't have any room to really move around. Remember, this journey was at a time where there weren't motorboats. There weren't really, these big massive vessels didn't really have rowing. It was all sail ships. So they would be on the sea for weeks and sometimes months at a time, packed in these conditions. Here goes another picture. You just get to kind of see how they're packed in there like that. Now, what Amari is explaining, which has happened in a lot of slave ships before, so it's not just Amari seeing it. Each person that you see, imagine that there's two people below them. Okay, like they're stacked like that, two people. These little tables, little shelves, like they're not even beds, they're shelves. Just a wooden shelf that you're laying on, and your feet are dangling. And imagine you get seasick or something, you have to vomit, or you have to go to the bathroom, you have to urinate, you have to do number two, which, I know it seems funny, but just, here, but imagine you had to like sit there, and where are you going to go? You can't ask the slavers, hey, I got to go to the bathroom. Can I go to the bathroom? They're not doing that. If you got to go, you just go. If you got to throw up, you just throw up. If you're bleeding, you just bleed. And if you're on the very top shelf, which you may be lucky enough to do that, then whatever you do, whenever you use the bathroom, it goes to the person below you. Okay. And on the second shelf, and they have to get all that waste. And then the person on the third shelf below them, they get the top two person, all of their waste, and it's just down on the bottom of the floor, and it's just all that smell. And if you get sick, and if you're sick and you waste, that means other people are going to get sick because you're throwing up or you're sneezing and coughing, or have feces and urine all over the place. So it was very ripe for diseases because of that, because it was very, very unsanitary. And I know one year I taught this before, and someone said, "Oh, they'd have to put me on the top." Like, you're a slave. Like, you don't have any option. Like, they just stacked you in. You didn't have option. Oh, I'm gonna be on the top shelf. No, you gonna be wherever they put you. That's how it is. So hopefully you're lucky enough to be on the top shelf if you call being a slave lucky. But that's the reality for thousands, millions of slaves when they Africans when they were leaving Africa to come to America. So just a little perspective, so you kind of see what it was like on these slave ships. So we go back here. Next paragraph. Here we go. The area for the women was in a separate location. Their feet were locked in leg irons, and they had only the rough boards to lie upon. But Amari noticed that they had more room and that the air was a bit fresher. Nor were they stacked the same way the men were. Amari was surprised to notice a number of children in their area. The men who had captured her group had killed all of the children. She had supposed because they were too much trouble to take care of. But the captives on this ship, as she found out later on the journey, came from all over Africa, and by many different ways. Amari saw a small boy who huddled near his mother. He was about the same age as Kwasi had been. She wished for a moment that he had lived so that she could hold him and comfort him. Then she shook that thought free. She would never want him to know these horrors. The ship of death was surprisingly very much alive. It inhaled and exhaled the foul air of where they lay chained, and it rolled with the rhythm of the water. Loud noises echoed down to them, pounding, changing, and screeching, and it seemed the white men were always shouting. She also heard laughter above. No one in the hidden, dark, beneath the ship laughed. All were silent with fear. Eventually, the activity above seemed to slow down. Amari felt a sense of anticipation, as if something was about to happen. Perhaps it was night. She could not tell. Afi, still chained next to her, quietly began to hum an old Yue song. It was a lament song sung at a funeral, a death song. She sang to the ancestors and to the other slaves. Gradually, even those not of that tribe joined in. Close to 100 women softly sang with her. It was the saddest sound Amari had ever heard. Now, just as we finish up chapter 7, you'll notice that there are children on the ship. You may be kind of confused, like, hey, what's going on? What happened? Why are there children there? Not children from Amari's tribe. There were many different ways that Africans became slaves and became part of the transatlantic slave trade. There were a lot of kidnappings, just as what happened to Amari's tribe, where they would come in and wipe out the elders and the children. You know, the elders were a sign of strength, and but if they were too old, they couldn't work. You know, it was in their mind, it was easier to get someone younger to break and bend. So you know, you tried to do that. But there were also a lot of slaves from other parts of the continent who were slaves to rich tribes. So remember, we said before that there was slavery in other parts of the world, even parts of Africa, before the transatlantic slave trade. But slavery to other countries and to those tribes, as Amari pointed out, they're totally different. You were more respected. You know, you might have gotten beat in a war and now you became a slave, but you're a respected community. You were treated with respect. But only rich, you know, people who were rich had those slaves. When the Europeans came over to start the transatlantic slave trade, then you know, they brought over guns and weapons, and some of the rich tribes were thinking that, you know, they get a hand up on tribes they were warring with, and they sent those people into slavery if they wanted a war. Now, you can make an argument that they didn't know the horrors they were about to inflict on their brethren after 300-400 years. Maybe they did. It just kind of turned a blind eye to it. You don't really know. We do know that because of that trade and because of that, that destabilized the continent of Africa. Like, Africa was never able to evolve the proper way that it was meant to. So there were, with people, you know, with the slave trade in general, different countries within the continent, you know, evolved at different paces. And there's several videos you can Google, look up, and just kind of see how the slave trade actually affected Africa itself, outside of the slaves who ended up going to America or South America and places like that. So we're finishing up chapter 7. Next, we'll be going to chapter 8. Thanks for reading with us. Appreciate you guys, and we'll see you in the next video.